Well, thank you everyone for being here. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak to you guys again. It's been a while. My name is Dave Lewis, and I have been doing security for, I can't believe I can say this out loud, 3 decades. I'm going to take my coat off because I was freezing, but it's just kind of funny when you figure out where I'm from. The really interesting thing that I find when we're talking about identities and things to that effect is that online, most people don't know who you are, and there's this famous cartoon of, you're a dog on the internet and all that sort of fun stuff. Now, I've been doing security in one form or another for a very long time, and I tend to be mistaken for other parties, but no, I'm just a regular old Canadian. I have done every manner of operation along the way. I've been a frontline firewall admin, pen tester, right through to being a CISO for a power company, and all points in between. And it has been very entertaining, and I've learned a lot of lessons along the way. So I am Canadian, and I do apologize. It can be contagious. Now, I identify as a hacker, and if you do a quick search on Google, you'll find out very quickly that people don't like us very much, which is kind of unfortunate because we really do have that innate curiosity as to how things work, how they can be torn apart and put together in a better fashion. And as I mentioned before, I spoke here about 7 years ago, so it is really cool to be back here again. Now, when we're talking about identity, trying to understand who is really an interesting thing. And this is something I do tend to spend a lot of time with, and every once in a while I get an idea that is basically like giving a squirrel a nut, and then I run with it. And this is a really interesting topic for me, personally. But first of all, we have to start off with a baseline as to, what is trust? And a trust is that belief and predictability of behaviors, outcomes, and given the scope of an activity. So this may seem overly simplistic, but when you put it in terms of software, we have to look back at things, for example, Ken Thompson's document about reflections of trust, where he built a code compiler, and every time somebody compiled an application with this compiler, it inserted a backdoor into the application, and it would change every single time. So the point here was, how do you trust things that you did not create yourself? And when we take that and we extrapolate it out, we have to look at our security controls. Because our security controls don't always work exactly the way you intend them to do so. We've seen this happen time and again with organizations around the world where things were put in, but they weren't looked at, they weren't configured properly, and things to that effect. So the other part of the coin is we have to talk about what is privacy. Now, privacy is really about the ability to keep your personal information from being known by others. Now, there's too many conversations I've had around the world where various governments, organizations say, oh, well, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. No, that's a nonsense argument. If I don't want you to see my stuff, I don't have to give it to you. It is very, very simplistic on that level. But when we're looking at it from terms of a security program, we have to understand that privacy can be an engine for change. If we're able to build privacy into our applications, into our networks, into everything that we deal with, we're able to really quite fundamentally build trust with the end users. If they are able to trust what we are delivering to them, they're going to do better things. Because we have to understand that the attackers are always looking for something new and exciting to cause us trouble with. Now, I use that term very specifically because that shows criminal intent. And just to demonstrate how easy it is, my boss, Wendy Nather, who unfortunately couldn't be here this year, she came up with a challenge for me. She was flying back from Europe from another conference she was speaking at, and she sent me this image that I'm going to put up here. And she said, tell me where I am. Me being a smartass, I answered back, you're on a plane. She goes, no. What flight? What seat? I'm like, okay. Apparently I have nothing else to do today, so let's have a look at this. So based on where she was looking out the plane when she took that shot, time of day that she sent it to me, I knew where she was based on the fact that I knew her favorite airline, which she would talk about on social media. So I was able to go through and find exactly what flight she was on, and I said, is this your plane? And she said, yes, now tell me the seat. Okay, this is fun. Next, pulled the flight manifest. There's wonderful sites like Seat Guru that can give you these sort of things. And I went through it and I said, okay, is this your seat? She said, well, no, that's my seat. So based on the wing and the sun and all the rest of it, I could tell roughly where she was. I could get it down to within one seat of where she was sitting on the plane. Now, the really funny thing is, all of this took less than 5 minutes. So when you frame that in the perspective of an attacker coming after you for whatever reason, it is a very trivial exercise for an attacker to get all sorts of information about your organization. LinkedIn was one of my favorite things to go after when I used to do penetration tests. If I had to go into a site and it was a black box, I'd go to LinkedIn, look at all the staff, sort out by all their certifications, all the other things like that, and very quickly I'm like, okay, hold on a second. There's my target list of things I have to go after. And the thing is, we have to understand that when we're talking about trust, we're talking about privacy, people, when they're born into this world, they default to trust. We're looking for food, we're looking for shelter, we're looking for ways that we know that we can be safe and secure without talking about security per se. And we have to understand that as security practitioners, we have to be able to work with folks so they can understand what it is that needs to be secured, how they can be secured in a way that's going to make sense to them. When we talk about Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers, if you have a chance to read that, you'll find different people hear things differently. And so you have to learn how to speak to them in a way that is going to resonate so that they will get that message across as to what security is. Because our threat landscape has really changed, especially when you take into things like the pandemic that we were hopefully in the dust. And we have to understand the whoops factor. Things are going to happen that are absolutely silly. So for example, in one particular company I was working at, let me go back up there. Yes, so one particular company I was working at, we were working with an outsourced provider in India, and we said, okay, we need you to do all the code development. They're like, no problem. We had the contracts in place and all the rest of it. I was on the job for about a week, and I was tasked with finding out how they were logging in, because they weren't sure if they were actually logging in. And I said, okay, sure. Sure enough, they were logging in, and developers from all over India were jumping in. And we could see from Chennai right through to Bangalore, they were accessing. But something in my ADHD brain didn't sit right. Something was really getting to me, and my brain doesn't work in a linear fashion, so I went through and I started looking at the distances between all of the cities, because why not? And I'm looking at it, I'm like, something isn't sitting right with me. And I looked and I said, plotted it out on a map, and I was like, something is going to speak to me at some point. Can anybody guess what the problem was? It's okay to throw things out there. I'm Canadian, I can take it. Sorry, say again? Traffic between sites. No, it was actually far more simple than that. They were using the same key fob to log in for all the developers. So each one of them would call in and their friend would read off the next code so they could log in. I couldn't get mad at them for the simple reason that they had not been trained up on security. We had not gone through in the contract and said, this is what we expect from a security perspective. So they were doing what they could in order to get their job done, but they didn't know that we were upset about it because we never spelled it out for them as an organization. These are the kind of things we have to understand, that when we're talking about security, these things happen far too regularly. And we have to figure out how are we going to define trust, because it's going to mean different things for different people. Especially when we look at the different models out there, and these are just a quick snapshot of the models that exist, and there's really no one model for trust that everybody recognizes. So when you're putting trust into complex systems, you have to realize that you're putting trust in every one of the component parts. And we'll look at the log4js and all that thing in another conversation, but that's where we have to realize that at some point something may break. And if we're trusting that entire system, we are inherently trusting all the different components. And that trust could be misplaced, so we want to make sure that we are understanding what is at stake for the end users. A valuable lesson in this case was the famous SolarWinds attack, where the attackers went after a billing system and it affected the power generation. These are things that really should not have happened. Now, what is an identity? Well, individual characteristics of a person, the thing is recognized. So your name, your height, your eye color, all the rest of it, these are different components. And when we're looking at identification, there's all sorts of different ways that we can do identification. Passports, driver's license, you name it, all of these sort of things come to mind. Then there's authentication of binding a physical person to an identification. That is another piece that we look at. And when we're looking at all the different options that are out there, we see things like these cards that are available, passports, all the rest of it, and then the typical stamp, oh yes, you got into the country. Nowadays, it's a far more streamlined process. For example, when I went from Canada to the US recently, I went out, scanned my face, went to the border guard, he went, thank you, have a nice day, and that was it. In the past, I got dragged into little rooms, had the thumb screws, all the rest of it, but thankfully the passport was able to identify me as who I was supposed to be. Now we have to understand that when we're talking about attacks, we have to focus on what the right thing is that we have to be concerned about. In Canada, we think about different things. One of my favorite stories was from back when I used to work for a defense contractor in the Washington, D.C. area, where we had some military types came in with this wonderful tool, and they said, we want you to have a look at this tool and tell us if this is going to improve security overall for when we're authenticating people to access systems. And I sat in the corner quietly chuckling to myself. My boss kept darting me evil glances across the table. And after a little while, we broke for coffee, and he pulls me aside, and he goes, "You've already figured it out?" And I said, "Yes." And he went, "Okay, well, the tool would go through, it would scan the retina, look for all this sort of information, and it was very rudimentary because this was the late 90s. And he said, "Okay, well, how is it going to be broken?" I said, "Well, it's really quite simple." He goes, "Wait, no, let's tell it in front of them." And I said, "You're sure?" I said, "Sure." So we sat down in front of the military types who remained nameless, and they said, "Okay, you couldn't possibly break into the system." I said, "Sure it could." Because it never checked to see if the eye was alive, and it was looking for very rudimentary details. Now, in the movies, when you see them take the eye out of a person to use it due to a scanner, that is not something that's going to work, because the retina degrades very, very quickly. So this is not going to be very effective. So that wasn't going to be part of the equation. Always got to work in the coffee breaks. Or Jim. So when we're dealing with how we're identifying folks, one of the problems that we've had to deal with since 1962 is the venerable password. This is the equivalent of using a house key to get into a domicile. So if you go to work in the morning, you lock your door, your stuff is safe, you go on your way. If you lose your key and somebody finds it, or they know whose key it is, they can get into your house and they can get access to your stuff. This doesn't mean that they're supposed to be there, but the house doesn't know any better. It's doing nothing to validate who that user is coming through the door. So passwords really are just a control. Calling them a security control is a little bit disingenuous. And when we're talking about data breaches, weak credentials, compromised devices, these are things that keep coming up over and over and over again. There's a website in California where they log all of the various different security incidents that have taken place, and almost all of them where somebody locked a laptop in a trunk and they said, "But it's okay, that Windows 98 system had a password." Fantastic. So we have to figure out how we're going to deal with stolen credentials when they're legitimate. I've seen so many reports that say, it's going to be 200 days before an organization notices that they've been compromised. Think about it, if it's only 24 hours, how much damage an attacker can do to your organization with access with legitimate credentials, or a device that wasn't patched to current or N-1. We have to look at things like zero trust, spit on the floor if you must, but honestly, it's really about risk reduction. It's looking at the user's devices and applications and how we can reduce the level of exposure. Now, one of the reports that I work on is called the Trusted Access Report, where I go through and I look at roughly about 1 billion authentications per month and see the different activities. Now, here we did an extrapolation last year from 2019 right through to 2022, and you could see there was a huge dip there for about 2 years, which oddly lines up with the pandemic, where a lot of organizations out there took the step to just go to passwords, get things out the door just so they could stay up and running. And I understand that, but we have to be able to go back and figure out a better way to improve things. There's biometrics. That has flaws as well. Nothing is 100%. And when we're looking at things like fingerprint readers on firearms, the good old gummy bear trick, we used that on a cash register at a restaurant in Chicago, and it worked perfectly well. And when we think about all the devices that are out there, it's rather staggering, especially when you look in the United Kingdom, and on average, people here have about 3.5 devices to their name. So these are targets of opportunity that if they're not patched to current or N-1, the attacker could potentially gain access. And when you look at how many passwords people are using, it's kind of mental. On average, 1,400 passwords per individual in an enterprise. Passwords, bad problems, all that sort of thing. We need to look at ways to decentralize authentications. And the first person to say, and there's the jet lag. Anyway, decentralized identities, and not saying, not Bitcoin, what's the other one? Thank you. I won't beat you up for that, but I appreciate it. we have to look at better ways to do this so we can decentralize identification and allow the individual to maintain control of their identity. This is absolutely essential. And we look at things like in Estonia, they have their digital passport, and this is really an interesting project where it's 11-character ID number, and they're able to represent in the digital realm as that is them, and they maintain control of their identification. That is the whole point of that. And it's not just in Estonia. This is starting to spread, where we see things like in the Cayman Islands, they're working on this project as well. In Australia, again, the user maintains control of their identity, and they maintain consent. And even in my home in Ontario, the same thing. The idea here is the individual maintains control. Now, when we're looking at these sort of things, it sounds like it'd be a finely tuned machine, but when things go wrong, they go really, really wrong. So how are we going to make this even better? And the idea here is looking at the future of identity. How are we going to improve things going forward? So me being the sci-fi geek that I am, I look at things like DNA. And in my grad school program, I've been looking at ways that we can do authentication using a DNA strand from an individual in addition to like the 11-character password we saw in Estonia. The really amazing thing is that, with Richard Feynman pointed out, there is a new way to approach things and how we're going to improve things, and we're looking at it from a biological aspect, using DNA as identification, or in addition to that, using as data storage. Now, the project that I was working on, I called it the DNA sequence identification system, which you will not find online. I don't have a project page up right now. I haven't actually touched this in about a year, but I'll be getting back to it again in January. This is just one example of one possibility that might work, but it's not 100%. Cancer is a great example of this. For example, my wife had cancer about 10 years ago, and her DNA fundamentally changed as a result of the cancer. And this will happen to cancer patients. Their DNA effectively is rewritten, which would nullify her credentials in this particular case. Another example here is if we're using DNA, monozygotic twins are a problem here where 100% of the DNA is shared between identical twins, or only 50% between fraternal twins. So if you have 100%, you have two people, all of a sudden they're having a shared identity, you have a collision there. But using DNA is not a unique idea, but it is definitely something that's gaining a lot of prevalence in various research universities. So there is a 99.9% chance you'll be identical to the next person in line with you, but about 400 chromosomes are 400 different chromosomes for the individual are specific to them. This is why your siblings will look different from each other and they don't look like the exact same thing, because the alleles form the same genes, and difference in the DNA basis, that's where the shift is. It's a very, very small portion of the code. And when we're looking at that and adding layers like an 11-character code as well, you have the potential for a large population base to have identification that is tied directly to them. But the key here is you have to allow them to have control of their own identity, because obviously I can see all sorts of horrible ways that this could go wrong. And when we're talking about that, we also have the potential for using DNA as data storage. In Zurich in 2015, there was a project here where they found that nucleotides could be used to write data to them, and it encapsulated DNA in these little silica glass spheres. Now, they were able to actually do this with synthetic DNA, and again, at Columbia University, they were able to write 250 petabytes of data to this per gram of DNA. So an individual, just 1 gram of DNA, 215 petabytes. This is really an amazing thing, but they were only able to achieve 85% of the theoretical limit, and this is very early days. When we look at this as possible, we could be our own personal data centers. The question here really is, if we pass away, how does that data get recovered, stored, or does it become genetic memories in the case of having children? One of those really interesting things that we can pull apart another time. Many of the issues that we find online really are things that were just there all along, that just the internet made it a lot faster. And a great example of this is this particular credential here. So this is just a sample credential that was found online on, I believe it was Wikipedia. Of course, I didn't leave a note there, but yes, it was on Wikipedia. Now, this is just standard, basic, very basic. You can see the zeros there. This is not a real identification. However, there was a bombing on the bridge in Crimea where the Ukrainian forces were able to take a shot at them and try and knock that bridge down. And the Russians said, no, it was actually this guy. He's from Ukraine. Now, small problem here. Are we seeing a pattern? This is probably one of the worst Photoshop jobs I've ever seen in my life. But this is one of those things where a lot of people thought it was legitimate. A lot of news organizations thought it was legitimate. A cursory search of the internet was able to find that was not the case at all. So how do we make these things better? We have to look at ways that we can democratize security. We have to make it easier for the end user in a way that they have control, they take back control, so we don't have these massive corporations. Pardon me. We don't have these massive corporations that are then controlling our data, and we have no say in the matter. That really shouldn't be the way. Now, when we're talking about different types of authentication mechanisms that we have available today, there's all sorts of things like biometrics, WebAuthn, things like that, right down to the venerable SMS, which unfortunately people still use. It is still better than the kick in the head, but I still don't recommend anybody use that. As well, there are technologies like passwordless. Now, passwordless, I found many different vendors have said many different things about it, and one of them actually said that QR codes were passwordless. No, it is not. WebAuthn is from an open standard that was put out by the W3C a few years ago, and this really is the forerunner to what is being referred to as passwordless technology, where for web-delivered properties, you can actually have uniform authentication across the board, authenticate once, and it handles it for you in the background. Essentially passwords, but done seamless to the user. So, what is it? Well, it's really about something you have and something you are. It sounds very simple, and this is the whole idea here. Most people have smartphones. There was one person I was speaking to yesterday, and they're in the room, that had a user that had no smartphone at all. And I've been in organizations where people would actively refuse to have a smartphone because they figured if they had one, that they thought that work would expect them to be on call all the time, which is disingenuous, but these are the kind of things that we have to deal with. When we're dealing with the human element, when we're dealing about authentication mechanisms, we have to make sure that we're finding something that's going to work for everyone, or at least as many as we can get our hands on. Biometrics has its issues. We have all sorts of different conversations that'll be, like the speaker that'll be coming up after me, we're talking about IoT, all the different authentication issues there, including the patching and all the rest of it, that are going to come up. And we have to figure out how we can do a better job moving forward. Because point solutions abound. There are all sorts of vendors out there. I work for a vendor. We have point solutions as well, but that's not why I'm here. The idea here is we have to look at something overarching, something that's going to do a much better job of getting security out to the masses. Because security folks, we're really good about talking amongst ourselves. One of the things I like to do is I go speak at a healthcare conference, or go speak at a legal conference, or an insurance conference. And they are always gobsmacked when they hear about something as simple as passwords, something as simple about network zone segmentation, things like that. Because these are not the type of conversations that they ever get to have. So we as security practitioners really need to do a better job of getting on and having these conversations to a wider audience. We have to figure out how we're going to build that power of trust. And when we're doing that, one of the great examples is there's the workshop over here. Adrian, are you in the room? No. It's a tabletop exercise over there. I'm blanking on the name. Oh, yes, threat condition. It's a great example of working with different groups within your organization, be it legal, communications, all the rest of it, so you can see their perspective and be able to work with them. So understand and break down those barriers and get across that lingua franca as to what is going to make the most sense, how we're going to get things to a better place. Now, I like to talk about pie-in-the-sky things about, DNA as authentication, DNA as data storage, and I'll do a lot more of this in the future, but this is just, the nice to have in the future. One of the things I would love to do is get a better conversation going with a wider audience now, so that we are able to go out and have this conversation to folks and get them to understand what it is we're trying to achieve. And I believe that we can do that because we have safety in numbers. If every person in this room goes out and talks to somebody that is a non-security person about security in a non-confrontational, very easy to approach way, that message will then start to filter out. It's really incumbent upon us to do that. And that's why I enjoy things like 44Con, where we'll build on that community and be able to have that conversation for a longer term. Now, I really do appreciate this. I'm sorry I only have a very short space of time today, but if you want to, you feel free to drop me an email, gattaca@cisco.com. I used to be on Twitter. It's still active, but I don't really answer that much, but you can feel free to drop me a line. And if you have any questions, I am at your mercy for a couple minutes. The gin got everybody, didn't it?